course, we are on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and like Chrissy, I pay my respects. We both pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So Greg Woodland, as Chrissy's told you, is many things. He's a script writer, he's a director, he's an editor, he's a teacher, and now he's an author. Welcome, Greg, and many congratulations on the release of The Night Whistler. How does it feel to finally have it out in the world?
Thanks, Suzanne. Look, it's wonderful. I'm absolutely delighted to have it out at last. It's been quite a long journey to get there, and thank you, Chrissy, too, for that great introduction. And hi, everyone. My family lives in Brisbane, and yeah, so I don't know that any of them are here tonight, but one of them lives very close to Avid Reader. I know that in West End. And anyway, I'm delighted to be doing this show. And yeah, it is so good to have it finished at last, because it went through a number of different incarnations, this story. And yeah, it's great to see it with some fantastic artwork from Jess Horrocks of text, and looking like a real book after quite a long time and many drafts.
Thank you, Greg. You know, it seems to me that we're all a bit of Queensland. We're all a bit Brisbane today. You've got family in Brisbane. Chrissy, I don't know if you're Brisbane born, but you're certainly Brisbane there. I'm Brisbane born. I'm a Jindalee girl. So it's lovely to be virtually home again. I'm going to take you right back. I'm going to take you back to 1967, and this is what's going on. Young Hal has moved into a new town, a country town of Moorabool. He's there with his young brother and his parents, and this country town is a bush town. There's a lot of roaming around, and the kids run wild. They run so wild that they find things that are unexpected. The first thing they find is a dead dog. Greg, tell me a bit about this particular dead dog.
They find the dead dog in a rusty drum, a 44-gallon drum, and he's been stuffed in a most horrible way. And he's been fairly brutally murdered to them. And, you know, they're quite shocked by it, but they pull him out of this drum. And their inclination, Hal's younger brother, Evan, is kind of quite spiritual. Hal's not particularly, but Hal's little brother, Evan, wants to give the dog a decent Christian burial, even though he was a big, fairly ferocious-looking German Shepherd. And Hal agrees, and so they give this poor dog a Christian burial, but the ground is so hard, they have to kind of scoop up leaves and branches to cover it up. And that's all they can do, a kind of, not even a shallow grave, but just a kind of makeshift shroud of leaves and branches. At the same time, Mick Goodenough, who's low man on the totem pole at the Moorabool cop shop. It's a four-man cop shop. He's definitely number 4, even though he was formerly a senior detective sergeant of homicide just a year before. He's fallen foul of the system in Sydney, and he's been promoted sideways, as it were, very much demoted down, busted back, in fact, to probationary constable. And so he's at the ripe old age of 43, he's a probie again in this little one-horse town of Moorabool. And he's not terribly happy with that position, but he's also going through a very kind of a deep estrangement with his wife and his daughter. He's not so much his daughter, who he's dying to see, but with his wife back in Sydney. And so his family is now 3 Alsatian dogs. And the one that's the youngest one, and that's kind of the apple of his eye, as it were, is the one that's gone missing. And he's hunting, searching around for this dog just before his shift. He's meant to be clocking on. It's just a week before Christmas. It's as hot as hell. And he's tramping around in the bush trying to find the wretched dog, Charlie, that's gone AWOL from his back fence. And of course, before long.
And this is how we unite this 12-year-old, curious, observant Hal and this demoted and slightly jaded Constable Goodenough. I want to go back to Hal for a moment. how, when he's wandering around in the bush, finds a caravan. The way you depict the caravan, there's something just a bit murky about it. Can you tell me what this caravan looks like and where it is?
The caravan's slightly like the one on the front, but it's the one I had in mind was a little bit bigger and longer, and it had two different ends because it was actually based on a real caravan called the Highway Princess, I think, or the Highway Queen, and it was a 1944. I think it was some kind of American caravan, quite a classic. They really went in for some quite amazing pre-Winnebagos back in the States. And, you know, they were meant for traveling the long distances in the US, and a few of them made it out to Australia. And so this unusual looking caravan that is in fact a kind of dirty yellow now, rusty yellow, has been abandoned on blocks of wood in the middle of this 15-acre or 30-acre paddock, rather, behind on the fringes of the town. And this is where Hal and his brother kind of roam, thinking it's terra nullius, as it were. They think that no one lives there, but then it turns out that someone visits there quite often. In fact, a number of people in the town visit there quite often. And the caravan itself becomes the kind of symbol, but also the receptacle for a lot of different people. Some of them well-intentioned and others extremely malevolent in intention.
There are strange things happening with murdered dogs. There are strange things happening with an abandoned caravan. And there's also strange things happening in Hal's house. Phone calls are starting. Tell me about these phone calls.
Hal's father is what was then called a commercial traveller, meaning he represented a food company that was based in Moorabool, and that was run by the two most powerful people in Moorabool, the kind of rich folks in Moorabool, the Curio family. They ran the food company that Hal's dad was kind of an up-and-coming manager in. And his job was to go and pay his dues for a while and go out west, take the products and samples out west. And he was often away for 2-3 weeks at a time. And being pre-technology, pre-mobile phone, he just basically drops off the edge of the world, which is what he loves doing, really. He's really quite happy to be away from home. And in his absence, Hal and Evan's mother, Corrie, starts getting these strangely disturbing phone calls at night. And they're, yes, the first time she hears it, she actually thinks it's her husband playing a trick on her, and she quickly realizes it's not. But a man's whistling down the phone, "Are you lonesome tonight?" The old Elvis hit. And he begins kind of whispering obscenities to her, and gradually, as these calls progress during the course of the book, he starts to whisper things to her that are really quite frightening to her, like, "Who do you want me to kill?" And then later, "Who do you want me to kill next?" And so, yeah, he's a creepy fella. And she fights him back in a number of ways, which I won't go into in any detail. I don't want to give you any plot spoilers. But she starts to fight back. And the more she fights back, the more he ramps up his little terror campaign as well. And he starts coming around the place as well, which is quite scary in its own way.
There are interesting things about setting a book in 1967. One of those interesting things is the lack of mobile phones. Of course, all phones are landlines. For me, having one of those prowler, obscene phone calls coming to a landline has something somehow more terrifying about it than having such a call on the mobile. I think that's because with a landline, the person knows exactly where you are. What do you think about that, Greg? What is fearful about that sort of call compared to calls to mobiles now?
Look, I think now we're so used to getting strangers call us up and people marketing, scamsters, the lot. We're quite, well, I don't know about you, but speaking for myself, I'm pretty easy with it. I'll even kind of reverse scam them and so on when they come in. But back in the day, at that time, I know that this was my mother's own experience. She found the calls terrifying. I mean, it was that part of the story is in fact based on a real thing that happened in the family, where my mother did have what she used to call a nuisance phone caller, and he did whistle. I don't think he whistled an Elvis song. I don't remember what he whistled, but he did whistle to her, and he would say nasty things. She would only say they were nasty things. You could only imagine what he was saying to her. But this went on over the course of a year when our dad was away. And the guy had an uncanny sense of when father was away. And so he would call up whenever dad was away, often on the very first night. And then at kind of fairly irregular intervals, he would call her up again and again, and carry on these frightening conversations where he'd, cover his mouth up and distort his voice and whistle to her and so on. And yes, it frightened the heck out of her, but she did become angry in real life. And my mother was a fairly feisty person. And so I imagined that the mother in this book would fight back, and she would ramp up her fight. But I know my mum tried a number of ways to get rid of him when his visits became more physical, and he would follow her, stalk her from the front to the back of the house late at night after the kids had gone to sleep when she was still up. He would just follow her around, and she would keep all the blinds shut and so on. But the cops, when she did complain, weren't particularly interested at all. They just kind of thought that she was a neurotic housewife, although as it happened, there were a number of neurotic housewives in that town, because a number of them were being pestered by this guy apparently around about that year.
I must say the police force doesn't come off too well in your book. Mick Goodenogh's a good bloke. He's a bit bumbling, but he'd be someone you wouldn't mind being friends with. Would you agree? Is Mick someone that you'd like to have as a friend?
Look, I wanted Mick to be an engaging, warm-hearted guy and smarter than the average copper. Whether he's smarter than the average modern copper, I don't know. But look, I did base Mick in some ways on interviews I had with three cops, and two of them were country coppers, and one was very articulate and open guy who'd been working on the force since the early 70s, and he was almost retired. In fact, when I think now he is retired, because he was heading for retirement the year I started interviewing him, an Armidale senior constable. And he told me that sergeants and so on that worked out of country police stations practically ran the town. They ran it their way. And so they had immense power, really. They often had to kowtow to the mayor or various other hoi polloi in the town. But as far as the ordinary citizenry went, the local sergeant or senior constable, if there was no sergeant, was kind of king of the town pretty much. And they could abuse that power any which way they wanted. And they often did abuse it. You only have to ask indigenous people about that. But some of them were quite fair, as it seemed, and tried to be fair. I wanted to paint a fairly kind of egalitarian picture. But yes, when he first descends, Mick is the only kind of decent cove in it. But before too long, one of the other cops turns around and sides with him as well. He develops a kind of colleague. I won't mention who it is for fear of plot spoilers, but he does develop an ally within the local police force. He turns someone around, but the rest of them, they're pretty useless, really.
When you say you're wanting to paint an egalitarian picture, you're talking about within the police force. You're not talking about within society generally. Is that right?
Oh no, it wasn't. It was anything but egalitarian. No, I wanted. What I meant by that was I wanted to be equitable about the cops, that some of them were good, some were not. You know, some were kind of efficient in their jobs, and some were totally useless, lazy, power drunk, and the rest of it. But they weren't all like that from, you know, from my conversations.
It's your book. It's a fictional world. Why did you want to balance that up? Why didn't you make them all great or all bad? Was there did you want to depict what you thought was the reality within this fictional world?
Yeah, I think without a doubt, you know, that most people who've lived in country towns for some time, or who've grown up in them, will be aware that some cops you want to stay on the right side of for fear of them, and others that you're happy to do that because you respect them. But you know, of course, we know now pretty well what police are like, especially in their attitudes, I think, to you know, to Indigenous people and to people who are different, maybe to migrants and so on. That in many country towns, police don't give other people a fair go. But I do think it's necessary to acknowledge the fact that there are good cops as well, working under hard circumstances. And, you know, after all, it's not fully a police procedural. And I think perhaps I get a little bit more into police procedural in the second book, the book I'm writing now. But in this particular book, it's as much police coming of age story as it is police procedural. But nonetheless, I did have to do a fair bit of research. And so I did go back into the archives a bit, into Trove and into online police links and so on, as much as I could find, as well as some books I read, some excellent books about, there's one called Australian Psycho, Derek Percy, and another one about the Wanda Beach murders. And in fact, reading, I'm sorry, for some reason I've forgotten the author's name. It's on the shelf behind me, but I can't reach for it right now. They were terrific true crime books that gave me a lot of insight into policing in the 60s there. And of course, policing in Sydney in the 60s was a different thing in many ways to policing in a country town. So when I did take it further, go further into the research, and I did start visiting country police stations, you know, I got further insights about how their power was even greater quite often in a country town. They had very little in the way of overseeing.
Are there two insights or even one insight that you found particularly compelling during that research of policing procedures? I was interested in the Wanda Beach murders and just what attracted you to those murders and what it was about it that gripped you enough to use that as a research prompt.
Look, when I was first starting this, and I knew that I had a strong feeling, but I wasn't sure that the original story I'm just looking at the cat walking across Kirsty's screen there. I'm digressing. When I first started digging around and looking at how I was going to write a crime novel that might come out of my original script for The Whistler, as it was called, which was the coming of age story of the family in the remote town and the prowler / phone caller, I knew I had to have a much stronger crime strand going through it. And I wanted a genuine cop. You know, in real life, the cops that my mother called couldn't care less, and they were pretty useless. They did come a number of times to our house, apparently. I think she got them to come fairly late. And once she came when she called and told them that the guy's up on the garage roof. He's up on the roof. And they did finally succumb, and they came around, and one of them got up on the garage, just pulled himself up on the garage roof and shone a torch around a bit and said, "No, missus, no one up here. He's gone." And she said, "He hasn't come down. He's still there. I heard him walking around." And anyway, you know, it was, no, he's long gone, lady. And when they went, she heard him run across the roof and jump down into the yard and kind of take off. So yes, that was the kind of policing that we had in real life back then. But I knew I needed something much better than that. I wanted the phone caller to be a genuine psychopath, somebody who was going to, you know, phone calling was part of his MO, but he was going to take it much further out than that. And so I needed a much, much better detective to take it out. And of course, I suppose, you know, a trope of crime fiction is almost a cliche, and in fact, is the fallen detective. And I wanted this fallen detective, but I wanted, of course, to twist the trope. And so I had him living with these dogs, a dog lover, and just other things as well about Mick, a jazz lover, and so on, and a great reader himself, a reader of crime, funnily enough. So I wanted Mick to be different than the standard, you know, country plod. And no disrespect intended to the good country coppers who are out there, because there's quite a lot of them, I know, and there's, you know, they do have some terrible things they have to deal with, of course. And but yeah, so I wanted Mick to be one of those good cops that was about a fair go for people, and that was trying to deal with everyone in a fairly even-handed way, and was trying to actually bring his version of justice. But unfortunately, his version of justice differs with the justice of the system out there.
You set the book in a town called Moorabool, and dutifully I Googled Moorabool to no avail, really. Is this a fictional town, or is this an actual town where you set your story?
Look, it's a fictional town, and it's a composite town. I grew up in country towns, and the story that happened that sparked the entire thing happened when we were kids in South Tamworth. And South Tamworth was a lot smaller town back in the late 60s than it is now. It's a huge, flourishing town of about 75,000, I think. Then it was a quarter that size. You know, it was a small town. The country music festivals changed everything. It's just completely blown up, and it's a much more diverse town, although, you know, Indigenous people again have stories that indicate not everything is hunky-dory there still, and yet it's a lot more bigger, more modern town than it was when we were kids growing up there. Later, my family, my dad, who was a former sergeant, you know, he always had itchy feet, Dad. He moved us around quite a bit from the country to the city. In fact, I was born in Brisbane too, and, you know, but at a very early age, we lived in Singapore for a while, and then because Dad was stationed there, and then it was back to Brisbane, then into country towns, and then from the country to the city where we grew up to, and then back to the country. So I lived in 3 different country towns, and the second was Tweed Head South, and that was an interesting place to grow up, quite different to Tamworth. I was there for a couple of years, and then by my own choice, I went to Armidale again because I wanted to go to UNE, and I was trying to be a scientist at that point, which didn't really happen. But I lived in Armidale for about 4 or 5 years all up, and quite loved it. But it had its dark moments too, Armidale. You know, some of those central west towns, the New England towns, do have a kind of dark, they've got a very dark history. And there was a kind of segregation there going on with Indigenous people who were very much pushed to the outskirts and barred from every one of the other 11 pubs, bar one pub. And they were very much fringe dwellers. And I wanted to show that a little in the book as well, give it that sense. So the town, to answer your question, Susanne, isn't a real town, and yet it's a composite of probably of those 3 towns, but a lot of other small towns in the area, you know, Guyra, Walker, Uralla, Glen Innes, Tenterfield. I spent quite a bit of time traveling around those towns when I was writing, doing location hunting for the script. And then later when I was writing this book, I went back and did another couple of trips to the New England, spent a few weeks there just traveling around, driving the distances as well, and just getting the feel for the roads and the environment, and, you know, living there as well. I had a brother who was then working in town, in Armidale, and I stayed with him for several weeks. And I just wanted to get the feel of it and immerse myself back into it again. And but previously, I'd actually wasn't sure we're even going to set this film that I'd been writing, and that was on the cusp of making in 08, 09. So I travelled to many central western towns, you know, Mudgee, Dubbo, Gilgandra, Grenfell, Forbes. There was a whole host of small towns that anything that clocked in under about 5,000 population, but more than 1,500, I went to. And I was also looking for a town on a railway line too at the time for different reasons. So I kind of, you know, drew up a list of towns and went to all of them and just took a lot of photos. Wellington was another one, and Cara and so on. So I got the feel of these country towns and the feel of the people that lived in those kind of towns quite a bit. And as a combination of the town and my memory, which is quite different from the town now, because I went back there too, to those streets where we lived as kids. The combination of those memories, the town and my imagination, and the composite town of the streets that I kind of put together through tramping around and doing location hunts, I came up with this town, Moorabool. And now, funnily enough, it's as real or realer to me as any of those towns. You know, I really kind of know the streets of Moorabool since I've had Mick and Hal and other characters tramp the streets at night and daytime, you know, with and without dogs.
You've mentioned a little bit the prelude to this book, or the first incarnation of the Night Whistler, and I'd like to ask you more about that. You're a script writer, you're a director, and the Night Whistler was first born as a screenplay. Walk me through what happened to that screenplay.
It's a very long and convoluted road, Susanne. I don't think I should take it out every twist.
You could make it short and snappy. Greg, I'm sure you can.
Okay.
So you write the screenplay. Things go well. What happens? I'm not a film person. What happens? It gets taken up by...
Okay. Look, yeah, it came out of the story my mother told me that I'd had completely forgotten about, or had no idea really happened, because she kept it a secret from myself and my four brothers. We were all little kids at the time this stuff was happening, when our father was, away on business. And so I was working as a jobbing director, having graduated a couple of years previous from AFTRS, the film school. And I was working, directing TV commercials and corporate videos and Defence Force training films and stuff like that for the police and education department as well. I was kind of just jumping from one small project to the other while trying to develop my own feature film, because I'd also made quite a lot of short films, and some of them had done reasonably well at the time in the late 80s, early 90s. So I had a number of projects I was trying to get up, and when my mum told me this story, I thought, that'd make a pretty good film. And I began kind of working on that. And over a number of incarnations of that script, I finally came up with this script that was able to attract a very good producer, Tony Buckley, at the time, who was a veteran producer. He'd done films like Caddy and The Irishman, and he'd done a number of those Bryce Courtney miniseries like Jessica and The Potato Factory, and I think one or two others. So he was an extremely experienced producer, and I wanted to work with him, and he was prepared to give me a go. This was going to be my first feature film that I was going to direct, and he liked the script, but it required a bit of work. I ideally did a number of drafts with him at the helm, and he managed to package it up, as they say, and we got Miranda Rotto on board to play the Australian actress, quite well known, and she was wonderful actress at the time, and really quite at her peak at that time. She was going to play the mother, and then we found an excellent young actress who'd been the star of Romulus, My Father. I don't know whether anybody's seen that, but his name was Cody Smith McPhee, and he was also in a famous American vampire film called Let Me In, and he was very good in that. In a big animation movie as well. He was doing very well at the time. He made 7 or 8 movies by the age of 13. So he was the same age as Hal. He was quite tiny. He was a very small kid, but he was such a good actor, brilliant. And I also had the star from Kokoda. I'm sorry, I forget the man's name. He was great, the lead from a movie called Kokoda, and a number of other very good character actors. So it was packaged up. We had Disney Australia going to distribute it. And it was all systems go. We had quite a bit of money in place. And then the GFC came about. And in a movie, timing is everything. And unfortunately, towards the smack in the middle of the GFC, when we were meant to be green lighting the movie and going, Disney decided they were no longer going to invest in Australian dramas. And so The Whistler was one of about 8 Australian movies that kind of fell over at the time. And, so I know some of those filmmakers who, some lost their chance too. But if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have written this book. So it's all panned out quite well. Really.
Look, it has all panned out well, and you strike me as an extremely optimistic person, but that's big news. That's gutting. I mean, isn't that gutting?
It was doubly gutting in the sense that I had another film that was ready to go that year too. And they both fell over. And yes, I went through a little bit of a down period for a bit. And fortunately, I have a wife who won't put up with you being depressed for very long. And her family's attitude is kick yourself in the bum and move on. And so I metaphorically did that. And I realized that, I didn't need 5 or 6 million or 4 million to tell a story. I'm a storyteller. Write a book, I thought. And so I did start, in fact, to write a book out of the other story, the other script that had fallen over that year. And it became this paranormal romance, a vampire story, which I'm also going to revisit next year, as I was mentioning before to you. So I wrote this one story. It did okay. It won some fellowships and awards and got me an agent, but the agent couldn't manage to get it to a publisher who would say yes to it. In retrospect, it wasn't. I think it wasn't ready. It needed some more work on it, quite a bit. But then I came around to the idea of picking up this old script from the bottom drawer, The Visitor. It had always stayed with me. I have another friend who's quite a well-known director, and he's had one story that's kicked around for him, or that had kicked around for 25 years, that wouldn't let him go. And this one hadn't been there for quite that long for me, but it had been there for quite a long time. And it just, those kind of stories that won't let you go, I think are telling you something, telling you to go back in and kind of visit them again. And that is exactly what I did do. And, I reworked it. And so that's kind of the history, I guess, the convoluted history of the story behind The Night Whistler.
You say those stories that never let you go or won't let you go. Aren't they the only stories that can withstand the time needed to write a novel? Isn't it the story that is a hook that won't let you go, that's the only thing that can be written? Otherwise, it falls apart. What do you think?
Well, I've certainly used to think that about movies, because movies have a very long gestation period. I think an average Australian film takes 7 years to get up. That's pretty average. Some take a lot longer, like my friend's film. He finally did make this movie. It wasn't the movie he'd written originally. And I think probably, although he denies it, I think he was probably disappointed with it. That took 26 years or something in the brewing, and it turned into quite a different beast. I think that with a novel, probably not many novels are going to take 26 years to work in. I think there's probably, a lot of novels do take 7 years, don't they? And Chrissy and Susanne could correct me on that, but I think probably most of the people I know who are writing books tend to take about 3 years or something to write a serious book. Perhaps I'm wrong, and there's no average really. How long's a piece of string? But that's roughly how long it took me to write the novel of this. About 3.5 years, a period of 3.5 years, I suppose. Yeah.
In the novel that I've just written, The Deceptions, the question that propelled me and kept propelling me was this. What is the place of truth, and how can you overcome a betrayal that is so large it's almost inconceivable? What was the question that kept you writing? What was the question that drove, that you were wanting to be answered, or the issue you wanted to most explore in this book? Because there are many issues explored.
That's a heck of a complicated question. I'm going to try and break it down. I mean, it's a good question. Yeah, I think there were two questions. Well, there are two main strands to the book. There's the detective's point of view, Mick Goodenough, and there's Hal, the boy's point of view. And so I think there was a different question leading both of them. Mick's was fairly simple: who murdered my dog? Because it was part of his family, and it goes back to family. Who's hurting my family? I'm not going to let this happen. And then when he realizes that someone's hurting Hal's family, he thinks, okay, this has gone far beyond a dog. In fact, he says to himself, he's got a saying, he says, get some perspective, detective. And it's a corny saying, but it makes him think that this is not just about him and his pet dog. It's about families. And so I think that ultimately the question that's driving him as much as Hal is, how can I protect this family? For Hal, it's how can I save my family? He's thrust into the position, because his father's absentee, he's thrust into the position of having to actually be his family's rescuer, which gets him into real hot water. But for Mick, it's how can I save this family? But I think also for Mick, he's got his own demons. So I think really it's how can I save my own family? I think that's how can I keep my family together? I haven't articulated that before, but I think you're right. I think that there is a question. That's probably how can I keep my family together? And I suppose in a way, that's true for me as well. You know, I haven't had to do that. I'm lucky. I've got a fairly close family. I have 4 brothers, and we're still best of mates, even though they're in Brisbane. 3 of them are in Brisbane, 2 of us in Sydney. We're all very close, so we haven't had to struggle to keep the family together. But we did have to look after our mother. Our father died quite some years ago. And I think it is an important question. I think that, yes, you've got to have a really searingly powerful question behind the story, or you're just not going to stay with it through all those different iterations and those, long turns you'll go through, twists and turns. But that's different from, can I just say, there's another sentence. There's a sentence. When I was a filmmaker, a script writer, well, I still am to an extent, but I'm working on other people's scripts now, not my own, as a script editor. There's a thing called the dramatic premise. And the dramatic premise is a short, active statement, a sentence that you want to find. It's hard to find, but until you've found it for the film you're writing, you're thrashing around a little bit in the dark, trying to work out what the heck it is I'm saying here. Once you nail the dramatic premise, you know pretty much exactly what the story is about. And so when I finally nailed the dramatic premise of the movie I was going to make, called The Whistler, it was lies lead to destruction. So there was a whole lot of lies being told, lies by nearly every character in the movie was telling lies. So a lot of that's in The Night Whistler. But I think the only one who's not telling lies, although he kind of is in a way, but they're white lies, as it were, is Mick Goodenough. Everyone else is telling lies. Hal's a huge liar, and that gets him into hot water quite a bit. But yeah, every other character in it is telling lies, and it does lead to destruction. But it's a different premise. The book has a different premise, so I won't spoil it to you. That was the premise of the film that might have been, back in, quite a while back.
That's fascinating stuff, Greg. I've got one more difficult question for you before we can throw to questions. And it might not be a question that can be answered simply, but just in the last couple of minutes before we do give the audience a chance to ask some questions, my question is this. One of the more engaging characters, I think, in the whole book is an Indigenous girl called Ali. You're not Indigenous. Ali's
No,
Indigenous.
yeah.
Recently, there's been heated debate, enormous debate about appropriation and who gets to write what about whom. What's your answer to that? Can you, as a white man, write a character who is full and who is engaging, but also an Indigenous girl?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question and one I wrestled with quite a lot. In fact, Ali was one of the main characters in um, the script as well, called The Whistler. And at that time, yeah, it did concern me. I had grown up in country towns and I'd known Indigenous people through different ways a number of times. You know, when I was a kid in Tamworth, there were some Indigenous kids at the school. I remember there was a young Indigenous girl who got a very hard time from some kid, and I can remember, which I'm not going to talk about it, it's quite moving, but I can remember the first moment I was aware that there was, because I was quite colourblind as a young boy, and I think a lot of kids are. I think we learn racism from older kids and our parents, and you know, my parents were kind of typical of their generation, kind of just not overtly racist, but disparaging of Aboriginal people in the town, you know, and that was fairly typical of white folks in the town. And in other places, there were Aboriginal people were figured much more largely in my life. In Tweed Heads, for instance, one of my close friends, a woman, had a boyfriend who was Aboriginal, and he was part of our circle of friends. There were Aboriginal kids at the school. There was much more acceptance on the surface in Tweed Heads, where especially if kids were sportsmen, Aboriginal kids who were footy players, for instance, could be virtual heroes in the town. But in Tamworth and Armidale was a different kettle of fish. And growing up in Armidale as a student, Armidale was in the 70s was a very diverse, richly diverse place, but it was harder. You were more likely to be friends with a black kid from Africa who would be there, as I was. I knew a couple of African kids from Kenya who were students in the town. You were more likely to know African kids than you were to know Aboriginal kids in the town, from my perspective. It was harder. They were more fringe dwellers. It was harder to see them. But then a friend of mine became a coach of the local Aboriginal footy team, Narwin. And so I did meet some of the young blackfellas there who are about my own age. I found them a little bit scary, intimidating, because I was the numbers were reversed when I came to a Narwin after game party one time, and but I found them tough young fellas and was expecting them to be kind of tough and heavy, but when I found them incredibly friendly. And when my friend died sometime later, excuse me for a minute, there was myself, his brother-in-law, as pallbearers, and 4 young black fellas from Narwin. And I could never forget that. So, excuse me, this is ridiculous. So I've always found Aboriginal people in the towns I've lived in to be immensely kind, and I simply wanted my town to reflect that stuff, you know? So I wanted people who weren't fringe dwellers, but who were actually centre stage. And I wanted them to have a voice of their own. So some of them, as with the white characters, some of them end badly and some of them get through. But I wanted to show them as resilient and thriving. And, you know, I did have quite a lot of contact with 2 other cultural readers more recently while I was doing the last couple of drafts of The Night Whistler. And they were incredibly generous to me and they liked the characters, which was a huge reassurance. They thought it rang true. So other people may have issues with that, I think. But I do think that, look, I look at it this way. I may not have a right to portray Aboriginal characters, but I have an obligation to, because if I didn't put them there, I'd be whitewashing the town and creating a kind of, you know, literary apartheid. And I don't want that. I wanted it to reflect the way those towns really were. And, you know, if I can just stop to take a quote from Margaret Atwood, this was at the preface of a book about American short stories from the early 90s. She wrote, essentially, she was talking about when people are told they don't have a right to write about another character. She wrote, not only does this view condemn as thieves and imposters such writers as George Eliot, James Joyce, Emily Bronte and William Faulkner, I've added not to mention Mark Twain and Shakespeare, it's only a short step from saying we can't write from the point of view of another to saying we can't read that way either. And from there to the position that no one can really understand anyone else anyway, so we might as well stop trying, you know. And I really do think, I think you've got to try to understand other people. As a writer, it's our job, you know, we have to walk a mile in the shoes of all our characters, whether we hate those characters or we love them, we've got to kind of walk with them and try to understand them, I think. I think Archie Roach, I heard an interview with Archie Roach on a Friends documentary recently, and he said something really interesting he said, we tell our stories and you tell your stories, and together we make a whole new story. And I like that. I think that's a really generous, inclusive way of looking at it. So characters, I accept that. And there'll be those that think I've done a reasonably good job on it. So, you know, decide for yourselves, really.
I'd like to call in questions now. I think, Chrissy, you explained to people how to use the chat function. Was that right?
Yeah, we've got a few questions already. So thank you both. That was a really, really interesting chat. So thank you so much for that. So we've got a question from Celia here who says, hello from Armidale. And Celia's asked about the big challenges moving from the form of writing a script to the form of writing a book. And what was the biggest challenge in the writing process of changing something from a script to a book?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, Celia. It's huge. But it's also joyful and liberating. I've been working as a scriptwriter for quite a long time, and I was really used to the, you know, the 3-act structure and the tyranny of script structure. So even though there's a kind of structure, you could call it 3-act to this novel. One thing I really liked about it was having to expand the world, and I had to build story worlds, and I had to really dig into the characters a lot deeper than I had in the script. I had to really, I knew the characters pretty well in the script, but nowhere near enough to write the book. So I had to really unpack those characters. And I loved doing that. I thought that was just great. There was a lot of digging to be done, a lot of mining. I had to develop other subplots, and I had to also, my first editor, Melanie Ostel, kept telling me, you need more world building, not enough. Tell us more about the world. And so I actually, in the original draft that I did, there was so much about the world that she wound up making me cut about 10,000 words out or something of it. There was too much world then, so we went back to less world, but there was a whole lot about the main street and the local cafe run by a Chinese bloke called Happy Arthur. You know, there's a corner store, which still figures, that still remains, run by a Hungarian Holocaust survivor, in fact. He figures in it still. So there was still quite a lot of world to build. You know, there was the pub, the local pub, the Cricketers Arms, and just the streets and so on. And she kept saying, give us pictures. And of course, from screenwriting, that's what you're meant to be doing. And you know, it's reasonably easy to do that in a screenplay. But I found I had to be more descriptive, and you know, it was difficult, but I did love it. And of course, I overwrote, as a lot of people do when they're writing their first book. I overwrote to heck. And I was lucky to have 2 good editors who helped me cut it right back. And yeah, so I hope that's answered the question.
I think that sounds pretty good. We've got a question here from Bianca Milroy, and congratulations, Bianca, on your shortlisting for the Queensland Literary Awards today. Bianca has asked, have you, I first heard of your writing through the ASA and the Varuna Writers Fellowship, and how did these opportunities enhance your writing and enable your career? Sorry,
congratulations, Bianca. That's great. Sounds like you've already had a huge leg up yourself. So that's quite amazing. But I will say, if you're writing, it's really worth joining organisations like Writing New South Wales or the ASA, and they both offer all these opportunities for people to apply for fellowships. I'm a serial fellowship applier. I've applied to Varuna numerous times. I've had won a few Varuna fellowships, and I'd also been abundant on and so on. And an ASA mentorship came up, application came up at just the time I was finishing the first draft, and I really, really wanted someone to look at it. I was feeling a bit lost, and that feeling where you can't see the wood for the trees. And I really needed a sharp eye on it. And so I was fortunate in winning one for one of the fiction ones I got, and I got the wonderful Melanie Ostell on board, who was incredibly tough, so tough it kind of threw me for 6 when I got her 10,000 word report on my book. It was huge. It's when I picked myself up again, I went through it, and I was determined to try every suggestion that she made out. And I found out that a large part of her suggestions, probably 80%, three quarters, 80% of the suggestions she made were good ones. And the rest she was fine about, you could use them or not use them according to her. So I did what I could with them. But yes, those awards really help, because Melanie, once I'd done one draft through that mentorship, she offered me representation. I didn't then have an agent, and so she became my literary agent. And it was she who worked really hard to put it before the main 6 publishers, and Text were one, and Text hung on. There was another publisher who was interested, but Text hung on, and they wound up getting it. They came on board. The great Mandy Brett, senior editor there, liked the book a lot, and so she fought to get it. And so, yes, I would say it's well worth applying for those fellowships and mentorships. I'm sure Susanne and Chrissy will tell you that you've absolutely got to, as a young writer, an emerging writer, not a young writer, an emerging writer, apply for those fellowships. They really help.
And there's a final question here about the, you write in all these different genres, including, the vampires that you were talking about before, and crime, and is there any problems with actually crossing genres, and have you found that there'd be any problem marketing a book in a different genre to the one that you've already got out there?
Yeah, that's a huge point. It's a very good question, because yes, I probably am going to find trouble hopping genres, because if this is The Night Whistler, if it's successful, then there will be a request for a second book, and the second book's on its way, so I'm certainly hope it will be successful. I'm kind of 2/3 of the way through the first draft of the second book, which is set at 4 or 5 years after that one. And I'm hoping that Text will accept that. I'm really hoping they will, because it's great to be with them. So I don't know what they'll think of this, if they're interested in doing the vampire book, but it struck me I may have to do it under a different name. Sometimes an author has to use a pseudonym. So it might be under another name to do this vampire one. Otherwise, people expecting it to be a crime, another Mick Goodenough and Hal book, and could be deeply disappointed. But I love genre. That's a fact. I mean, years ago, I wrote a romantic comedy with 3 other people, another guy and 2 women. And that was a lot of fun. We didn't wind up making that. We got a lot of interest from some well-known producers, but it didn't happen. But I love hopping genres, so not that I want to write a romantic comedy book right now. I'm more into the dark stuff. I'm kind of deeply embedded in crime, rural crime especially at the moment. So that's really where I want to stay. But the vampire one is one of those stories that keeps calling me back. I really love the the vampire and that, and a couple of the other horrible characters that are in it, and some of the good ones. And so, yeah, there's a story there. It's about family too, a love for family, that story. And so, yeah, I will return to that. I think genre is just a kind of vehicle for telling stories, really. And it's, you know, you have to bring other things to genre. Genre crime, for instance, is really about values and issues, I think. And without them, if you don't have those values in a book, then I think it's just another crime book or just another silly vampire book. You know, you've got to have that kind of something that's deeper within it, you know, some other thing, question, or some other sentence in there to make it worth the while writing, let alone reading.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure that we're all just hanging out to read your book, which was launched yesterday. So congratulations. And thank you very much, Susanne, for this fascinating conversation. It's been really, really excellent. I've opened the room up so that people are allowed to unmute themselves, and we will go for a clap in a minute. But was there anything you finally wanted to say before people unmute themselves and clap?
I'd like to add my congratulations to Greg to say what a wonderful novel he's written, which I'm sure will have enormous success. I'm a board member of the Sydney Crime Writers Festival, and so certainly our eyes are on writers like Greg. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you so much, Susanne and Chrissy. Thank you for having me on the show. And I wanted to say that, you know, I had wanted, I'd originally asked somebody else to be the launcher of my book because they were another crime writer specifically, and someone about my age who I knew reasonably well. But unfortunately, he couldn't make it due to health issues, un-COVID related, fortunately. But Susanne, I've been a member of her Thursday night book club for about 6 weeks now, or 7 weeks. And I saw her interview, do one of these Zoom interviews with Caroline Overington, the author of Missing William Tyrrell. And she was just so spot on with that, that I really thought, my thought was at the time was, why didn't I ask Susanne to do it? Well, mainly it was because she wasn't a crime writer, but then of course I found out she has this connection with Bad Sydney as well. And she's an amazing interviewer. And so I'm so fortunate to have a fairly gentle, but very rigorous interviewer in the form of Susanne here. And so thank you so much, Chrissy, as well for having me on the show. And it's great to see you guys here. And yeah, I really do hope you enjoy my book.
Congratulations. It's time for everyone to congratulate. So you all can open your audio and we might give you a clap. So thank you very much. See the group there. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you very much. It's great. Yeah, Evelyn. Hello, Evelyn. Good to see you. Evelyn's a colleague of mine. I didn't know you were there.
The name.
Good to see you.
You too.
So thank you very much for your questions too, guys. And really delighted to be here. And yeah, hope you enjoy my book.
See you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.